Hey everyone, and welcome back to Identity Talks. We are lucky enough to have Grady Summers back on. He is our EVP of products. And today we're going to talk about a topic that continues to be on everyone's minds, which is data breaches, something we're all pretty familiar with. But today we're going to get a little bit deeper into where identity fits into the data breach conversation. So, Grady, thank you for coming back.
Hey, Hannah, you bet.
We want to know sort of, you have some interesting experience with Mandiant, and you mentioned in your last Identity Talks episode that you noticed a connection between identity and the intrusions that you saw in your research there. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So this is an area that I'm pretty passionate about, both the time I spent at Mandiant and FireEye, all the way back to, my experience at a large enterprise responding to breaches. One thing that's become clear is like identity is at the nexus of every one of those breaches. And the research you mentioned was what we used to call the Intrusions report. We still have the Intrusions report at Mandiant, where we would kind of share the research, the things that Mandiant had learned from the last year of responding to breaches. And I'll never forget, I think it was the first one I worked on, like the 2012 or maybe 2013 report. And the stats that we shared were that 54% of our breaches at the time, the compromised computers, compromised devices, didn't even have malware on them. They had been accessed with a legitimate ID, but they weren't compromised in the way we often think of malware compromising a device. The other stat that kind of hits you in the face is the fact that 100% of the breaches that we investigated involved stolen credentials, right? So you think about that. Attackers are coming in and they're stealing credentials. Identity is right there in the middle of these breaches, and I think that's continued to hold true over the years. That's the way attackers are getting in. They have a variety of different ways they might get into an organization, but the first thing they're going to try to do is to get credentials that then allow them access to the data, the application they're trying to get to. So I think as the world becomes so much more deperimeterized, we've been talking about that for a decade or more in cybersecurity. But we see it so clearly now with organizations using more SaaS applications and storing their data out in the cloud and taking advantage of the public cloud. To the extent there was ever a notion of a firewall keeping us safe, I think that notion is long gone now. And it really comes down to protecting your identities and making sure the right people have access to the things that they ought to.
Okay, so given that breaches and identities are so linked, how does a good identity management strategy help secure a company? What does that look like for organizations in practice?
So, in the world of identity, we talk about access management, identity governance, and of course, privileged access management. And all three play a role, but of course, I'll hone in on identity governance where SailPoint plays. But on the access side, you want to make sure that users are appropriately authenticated and that you've got multi-factor authentication in place to do everything you can to make sure that person who's authenticating is indeed who they say they are. And then we're on the privilege side, you want to make sure that you're properly protecting those privileged accounts that have access to the most sensitive information. Those two might be the obvious ones that someone might think of. I think identity governance plays such a key role, though, by making sure that people only have access to the things that they need to have access to. And I can tell you firsthand, I've seen very lax provisioning or over provisioning make the job of the attacker so much easier. You think about it, the attacker, let's say they're phishing somebody, right? And they're phishing for, a Microsoft 365 account, right? And spoofing an email login to try to get credentials. When the attacker is successful, and they usually are successful, you want to make sure that that credential is tightly scoped to what the user needs to do. And you really, in effect, want to force the attacker to have to keep working harder and harder to find the credentials that give them access to the data they're going after. And this is something we talk a lot about when we're back in the enterprise talking about defending a network, is making the attacker's job harder, making it more expensive. And I think an important thing and really a relatively easy thing that organizations could do is make sure that the entitlements are applied properly, that roles are tightly scoped. A really important one is making sure that there aren't orphaned accounts out there, that when somebody changes jobs or leaves, we always think of the leaver, right? Make sure you turn off access when they leave. It's just as important to make sure that people don't accumulate entitlements. When they change jobs, you're taking away the access they no longer need. And those are the types of things I can tell you will make it a lot harder for attackers to do their job. And that should be the goal of every kind of cyber defense organization is raising the bar on the attacker.
Well, thank you so much again for joining us again, Grady. I know our viewers got a lot out of this conversation. And for those of you watching, we hope to see you again soon on another episode of Identity Talks.